This is the fleet that lay dead in the mud of Pearl Harbor, and the admiral who refused to let it stay that way. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japan's carriers sent the heart of the American Pacific Fleet to the bottom of the harbor in under 2 hours. 4 battleships sunk outright, 4 more crippled, and over 2,400 Americans dead before lunch. By any normal measure, the Navy's battle line in the Pacific was finished. 3 weeks later, Chester Nimitz stepped off a Navy plane at Pearl Harbor to take command, into a harbor that still smelled of fuel, oil, and smoke. He didn't arrive to a fleet. He arrived to a graveyard with masts sticking out of the water. Most of the ships that mattered, Nevada, California, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and the destroyers Cassin and Downes, weren't just damaged. They were dead, sunk to the harbor floor or capsized in the mud, some of them still burning under the waterline. The kind of damage where the smart move is to cut your losses, scrap the hulls, and rebuild from scratch on the mainland. Nimitz didn't take that advice. He had one asset almost nobody else in his position had: patience under pressure, and a willingness to bet years of labor on ships everyone else had already written off. His carriers were becoming the center of his strategy. That much was already clear. But carriers couldn't escort themselves, and an island-hopping campaign would need shore bombardment. If the battleships could be raised, repaired, and rearmed, he'd find work for every one of them. So on January 9th, 1942, barely a month after the attack, he handed the impossible job to a man built for exactly this kind of impossible job: Captain Homer Wallin, promoted overnight into command of the largest ship recovery operation the Navy had ever attempted. Wallin wasn't a battlefield hero or a strategist. He was something rarer for the job at hand: an engineer who had spent nearly 3 decades quietly learning the guts of these ships from the inside. He'd entered the Naval Academy back in 1913, served aboard a battleship during the First War, and built a career around the unglamorous work of knowing exactly how a hull holds together and exactly how it fails. Nobody in the Navy was better positioned to look at a sunken battleship and see a path back to the surface. Admiral William Furlong, the new yard commandant, and an Annapolis classmate of Nimitz's, gave Wallin everything he needed: divers, tugboats, welders, and a fleet of small craft to move men and equipment wherever the harbor demanded. Furlong understood the stakes personally. His own flagship, the minelayer Oglala, was one of the wrecks sitting at the bottom of the same harbor Wallin now had to clear. And beneath the water waited an enemy nobody had trained for. Not the Japanese, but the wreckage itself: twisted steel, buried ordnance, and compartments filling with hydrogen sulfide gas that could kill a man in seconds if he opened the wrong hatch. The work was about to begin, and nobody in that harbor yet knew if it was even possible. Not every ship needed the same miracle. Tennessee had taken 2 bomb hits, but was seaworthy again within weeks, back in service by February of 1942. Maryland and Pennsylvania followed a similar path: damaged but never lost, patched up fast enough to steam for the mainland under their own power, while the truly wrecked ships waited their turn. Nimitz's yard crews worked in order of urgency, not order of prestige, and the ships that could fight sooner got fixed sooner. But the harder cases were the ones that defined the operation. Nevada came first among the sunken battleships. She'd been the only one to get underway during the attack, deliberately beached to keep from sinking in the channel and blocking the harbor entirely. That decision saved her and made her the proving ground for everything that followed. Crews welded steel patches over torpedo holes, then dropped in deep well pumps capable of moving 4,000 gallons a minute, fighting to empty her faster than the harbor could flood back in. On February 7, 1942, A sailor opened a sealed compartment below deck and dropped where he stood. 5 more men went in after him. Only 4 came out alive. Hydrogen sulfide, an invisible gas born from oil and seawater, rotting together in the dark, had turned Nevada's flooded compartments into a trap. After that, no one went below without a mask and a strip of paper to warn them the air had turned lethal. 1 week later, on February 14th, tugs eased Nevada toward dry dock number 2. Nimitz was there on the dock to watch her come in, standing in a cheering crowd that had spent 2 months wondering if this day would ever come. By April, she was steaming for Puget Sound under her own power, headed for the overhaul that would carry her all the way to the beaches of Normandy and Iwo Jima. California surfaced in March. West Virginia, hit by 6 torpedoes and 2 bombs, one of which never went off, came up in June, then spent 2 more years in overhaul before returning to war in July of 1944. The minelayer Oglala took until midsummer, refloated by rolling her hull upright and pumping her clear. Each ship taught the salvage crews something the last one hadn't: better pumps, better patch techniques, and a sharper instinct for what a wrecked hull could still survive. Not every ship got the same mercy. Cassin and Downes, 2 destroyers caught together in a single dry dock, were battered so badly by fire and repeated flooding that their hulls were beyond saving. Bombs had ignited fuel and torpedoes in the dock itself, and Cassin had actually rolled off her blocks onto Downes as the water rose and fell around them. But their engines and their machinery were sound. So the Navy did something almost unheard of. They scrapped the ruined hulls entirely and built brand new destroyers around the salvaged engines and equipment, giving the new vessels the same names and the same hull numbers as the ships that had burned. Cassin and Downes did not come back to life. In a sense, they were reborn from the parts that survived. 2 ships never came back at all. Arizona's hull was too shattered to raise, and her wreck became a tomb for over 1,000 of her crew. Oklahoma was righted at enormous cost, using cables and winches to roll her more than 150 degrees back onto her keel, then stripped of anything usable and eventually scrapped. Not every bet paid off, but most of them did. By the time the war ended, 5 of the 8 battleships written off on December 7th were back in the fight. Nevada shelled the beaches at Normandy and Iwo Jima. Tennessee, California, and Maryland fought at Leyte Gulf, the same waters where, in one of the war's stranger turns, they crossed the T against a Japanese battle line and helped close out the era of battleship combat for good. West Virginia, rebuilt from a wreck with a torpedo hole you could walk through, was there too. None of that happens without the decision Nimitz made in his first month on the job: to look at a harbor full of dead ships and see a fleet instead of a loss. It would have been easier and defensible to write them off. The Navy's own engineers weren't sure some of them could be saved. But Nimitz's carriers needed escorts. His island-hopping campaign would need shore bombardment, and Homer Wallin's salvage division needed 2.5 years, thousands of workers, and a willingness to lose men to poison gas and twisted steel to prove that faith wasn't misplaced. It's worth remembering that none of this was inevitable. A different commander might have looked at those capsized hulls, at the cost, at the years of labor required, and simply written the check for new construction instead. Nimitz chose the harder, slower path, betting that the fleet Japan thought it had destroyed could still finish the job Japan started. The ships that sank on December 7, 1941, didn't just come back. They came back to finish the war the attack had started, steaming into Tokyo Bay in 1945 to watch Japan surrender, within sight of the harbor where they had once lain dead in the mud.